Right, welcome back. In this segment, we are going to explore how to set the transforms on your data such that you get better separation with your markers on your tSNE and UMAP plots and in your FlowSOM clusters. So if you look at FlowJo for your data set, you will see that the data have a certain pattern to them in that you have division of your CD3 and CD19s, for instance, and we looked at this earlier by changing the transform here on the customized axis. So if we open this up again, you can see that the default in FlowJo is a bi-exponential scaling of the data. What we're going to use in R is this hyperbolic arc sine transform that looks something like this instead. And you can see that this is actually quite different. And we can change the amount of compression by playing here. And you can see that depending on how you plot this, the data really looks quite different. And so we're going to be modifying those parameters in R in order to make the data look in a manner that more or less matches what we see here. And so you may want to have your analysis in FlowJo open so that you can see what each parameter looks like. So for instance, if we had our CD4 and we were going to have one of our difficult markers, say CTLA4 open, you can see this is what the CTLA4 looks like when we assess it here in FlowJo with the bi-exponential transform set more or less appropriately. You can see that there's a bit large negative population and then this plume here, which would be our Treg population. And there's not a big spreading. So for instance, we could change the display here and set this such that we now have a big trimodal population actually. You can see you have 1, 2, and 3 peaks when really all of this is just negative spreading. And by setting it like this, there would be as much difference on the scale of the data between these cells here and these cells as there would be between all of these cells in the negative area and these actual positive events up here. So what we would want to do is scale the data such that we focus on the distinction between what we consider to be real positive and negative in the data so that we don't pay attention to minor variation in the negative events that's due to spreading errors or unmixing errors, but rather focus on the distinction between real positive and negative expression values. Right. So we're going to go into R and take up from where we left off. If you aren't certain where we left off, you can always go back to the beginning of your analysis script and start over from the very beginning by running Control-Enter. And that will take a moment, but you'll get to the same point in the end. All right, so now we're going to start by transforming the data where it says hashtag transform on line 235. So select this, and again, Command-Enter. And we're going to plot the data density distribution. So basically what we've done now is transform the data using these values that we've typed in the parameter file, which if you remember earlier, we set to being 200 for each file, for each parameter. So we've just applied that basic default transformation. And now we're going to plot that here in this next section to see what it looks like. And this is going to take a minute. So Command-Enter on this part. And then we're going to go to our output folder and look at the density plots once they come out. You can see that R is still working here. And the length of the time that it takes for this will depend on how many events you have. In my case, there's actually quite a lot. So again, here, this is where downsampling on the density distribution parameter in the parameter file, this one, could be helpful. Right, so now we're finishing up. And you can see it's telling us this information. And in a second here, it will output our density file. And you can see that it's already created the file and it's just filling out the details. All right, so it's now complete. We open this up. And what we have here is histograms of each marker in our flow panel for each of the samples. And also at the top, we have the conditions, which are concatenated from the individual samples. And so that you can see it down below, each of these groups is color-coded, and that matches the color coding at the top. And so now we want to look at these markers and adjust the bi-exponential display such that we have bimodal peaks. So for instance, take a look at our CD4. We have in our data set CD4 positive and CD4 negative cells. We do not have 3 different populations. So this first 2 populations are negative cells that have been spread because we haven't compressed the data enough. So we need to increase the number to increase the amount of compression being applied to the negative. So for that, we would go to our parameter file, scroll up to these numbers here where the scaling is being applied, and look for our BUV 496, which is our CD4. And again, you may need to go up above to look at what each channel is. And so here we're going to put in a larger number. In this case, I'll put in 2000. And this is a bit of trial and error, and you may not know what the marker is supposed to look like. You should be able to figure out in a lot of cases by looking at FlowJo to see what the distribution looks like. If you aren't certain if it's correct, have some tries and then ask questions. So I'm going to go through and take these default values and edit them to more appropriate values for Aurora data. Because we have a large parameter data set here, we're going to have more spreading in the negative. We're going to need to apply more correction across the board. The other thing we will try to do with this is adjust the amount of separation there is in the data such that each parameter is contributing equally to the separation in the tSNE. That's a bit harder to do. Most of that's being done by the design of the panel rather than at this point on your actual analysis. And so what we're trying to do is not only eliminate spreading that's causing trimodal populations, but also false negatives. And so if you look in FlowJo, you'll see that there isn't this tail of ICOS super negative cells. That's really probably just either spreading in compensation or unmixing error that really should just be grouped in with the negative. So by increasing the compression, we can bring that up into the negative population and ignore it. And so for CD69, it looks like we have a bimodal population, but if you look closely, you can see there's actually this peak here on the right-hand side. So this is actually a false negative that needs to be grouped in. And again, this is something that once you've done it once for a particular panel, shouldn't need to be done again. All right, so once we've edited all of those, again, we need to load this into R with the new variables, save this, and then we need to go to the analysis file and run everything again from the beginning, because rather than transforming the data that have already been transformed once, you need to load them in and transform them fresh from the start. And we're going to close this density image because it's going to create a new one based on the numbers that we've just put in. All right, that's finished. We'll open up again. And now let's have a look at this and see how it's changed. So for instance, our CD4 is now bimodal for the most part. You can see that there's still some spreading in the negative here, particularly in this set of samples. And so we would actually want to compress this further. Rather than going up 10-fold as we did before, we'll probably go up 2-fold or so. So something like 5,000 now. So now most of these probably look about right. So you can see, for instance, our FOXP3, we have this tight negative, and we have our positive here. Some of the populations, you won't be able to see the positive events very well. And so you may need to either guess or know from experience. The best way of doing it is actually to create a set of cells that are negative and a set of cells that are positive in FlowJo by gating on specific subpopulations and exporting those and then loading them into R. So that, for instance, if you gated on NK cells, which are TBAT positive, versus B cells, which are TBAT negative, you'd be able to load those both in and see how they look and what kind of separation you're getting in here. Here now we have our Chi67 with a negative population and a positive tail. Our CCR9, we now have this clear positive negative. Our Ly6C has this population here. Our CD103 is relatively low expression, so we could consider compressing it less. This will probably be okay. The NK 1.1, we can't see the NK cells because there's not very many of them in our total T cell population. We've excluded basically all the NK cells, and we're just looking at a few rare NKT cells. Most of these others of these look pretty good. The CD44, we probably could compress more because you can see that our peak CD44 high is just this little part here. So this tail here is probably super negative events that are unmixing errors. So we can increase that one. Our CXCR6, this is the positive here, this small population. So our negative is actually taking up more space on the plot, and we want to compress that probably 4 or 5-fold. Let's put that at, say, 4,000. Most of the others of these actually look relatively negative because most of the cells are going to be naive cells that are expressing these activation markers. So in a way, that's kind of what you're looking for is a compression of the negative and a relatively even compression of the negative between the different markers. So for instance, our CD25, ST2, and neuropilin here are much more compressed than some of the others, same with our KLRG1. So we would either need to decompress these a little bit or compress the others more. I'm going to choose to decompress the CD25 and the ST2 and the KLRG1. And otherwise, we're probably pretty okay. Again, it's one of those things where it would be best served by loading in specific populations and having a look, or running the sample multiple times through the entire script and seeing what produces better results in terms of how the clusters and the markers associate, which we will see later. For now, I'm going to close this, save my changes, load in these changes, and run this again. So to run something that you've just run again, for instance, a couple commands ago we ran the entire script up to this point, we just hit the up arrow. So the last thing I loaded in was the changes to the transforms, and then before that was the script. So by pressing the up arrow twice, I get to that, and now I just hit enter, and it runs that command again. So we will wait a third time for it to run the transforms, and once that's complete, we'll proceed with the rest of the analysis if we're satisfied with the output. All right, that's finished. Let's open it up again and have a look. So now our CD4 is these nice, neat two populations. And the other ones we changed over here were decompressing the CD25. So you now see that the CD25, ST2, and neuropilin, the negative populations are similarly compressed to these other ones. And you could refine this a bit more if you wanted. Depending on how much you compress the negative, you will have more or less similarity between cells that are in the negative compartment, and that will define how much space those cells occupy on the plot, particularly for the UMAP, how close they cluster. So you can adjust the appearance of the data such that you have basically no variation in your negative, which will then result in very granular binary clustering on your plot. Anyway, this is adequate for us to proceed and see what sort of results we get. You can see that maybe I have now compressed too much the CXCR6 and NK1.1. So really, I would probably want to do this again to get a better value for those, but it's close. All right, and that concludes the section on how to adjust the transforms of your data. In the next segment, we will proceed with running the tSNE and UMAP.